I am a senior research fellow at the Program on Extremism. And you're joining us here today for the ISIS Reader event. We're hosted by the Program on Extremism in partnership with the Naval War College at the Naval Postgraduate School at Monterey and the International Center for the Study of Radicalisation in London. The ISIS Reader is published in the US by Oxford University Press and in the UK by Hearst Publishers. As you all got an invitation, there's a 30% discount for your own copy of the book. I've got my copy, so I highly recommend you check out that discount and order your copy as well. Joining me today are the three authors of the ISIS Reader. We have Dr. Haroro Ingram, Senior Research Fellow at the Program on Extremism, Charlie Winter, Senior Research Fellow at the International Center for the Study of Radicalisation at King's College London, and Craig Whiteside, Associate Professor at the Naval War College at the Naval Postgraduate School and a Program on Extremism Research Fellow. Thank you so much for joining us today. Before we begin, to our audience, I'd like to let you know that we'll be having a bit of a discussion here among myself and the authors of the book, but we really would like some interaction and engagement with you. So if you look at the bottom of your screen, there's a Q&A button. So please check that out. Begin to ask your questions now. We can see them, and we'll be taking questions from there, and I'll be asking them to the authors. So let's begin. Craig, I'd like to begin with you. Can you tell us a bit about the backstory of this book? What was the motivation for not only writing a book on the Islamic State, but really choosing a reader format?
Right. Thank you, and thanks for hosting this for all the entities involved, and we're pretty grateful in this really extraordinary time to be able to talk about something that Charlie and Haroro and I put a lot of work into, along with a lot of other people at Hearst and other places to make this happen. The backstory is the three of us has shared a connection for a long time, and a lot of that connection was sharing primary resources, trading them like little kids trade baseball cards, and asking if we'd seen each other's statements or if we'd seen these statements. And a lot of our focus has been not simply on propaganda, but also leadership statements, strategy documents, and trying to figure out and understand and then later communicate through different writings of all of us the causal logic of what the Islamic State is trying to do and has done throughout its history in the movement to create and achieve its political end state. And there's a lot of great work already out there in a lot of different forms. Barak Mendelssohn's, Aaron Zelen, Ayman al-Tamimi, the CTC, the ISIS files at George Washington. There's lots of sources of primary documents and other sources, but we wanted to put it in a place that would help readers, researchers, analysts, policymakers, and practitioners get a chance to understand or listen to ISIS in their own words, but also with really contextual analysis to put it in its place in history, the people, etc. And Haroro and I, also one of the hidden motives was to debunk some of the legends that are out there about this group that largely derive from their propaganda or summaries of what we think their work, their texts are, and really foreseeing analysts and people like ourselves to really go towards the actual documents and look through these. For a while, Haroro and I used to joke around and call this the unread reader. So these are the texts that people should read about this particular group. And for a while, I almost thought that was the title. And to hit that point a little harder, there are texts that I think I've read my first Islamic State text in 2007, and even a year or two ago, there are texts in the book that I had not actually read the entire document for. And I think taking my own medicine, that's something that I learned from this process and working with my two colleagues.
Excellent, thank you. Charlie, I'm going to move over to you. I wanted to ask you what the most surprising part about researching this book was for you, and a bit more about the process for selecting the texts and speeches that you used in the book.
That's a good question. I remember it would have been back in 2018 now, early 2018, I think, when we were first talking about getting the book together. And I was in Washington, and I think I was having breakfast with you, Craig, just after flying in the night before. And that week ISIS had just published a new edition of one of the texts that appears in the book, Advice to the Leaders and Soldiers of the Islamic State, which was put together ostensibly by Abu Hamza al-Muhajir, leader back in the 2000s. And essentially it was a way to, as he saw it, navigate what was then ISI, the Islamic State of Iraq, through a very tricky period of time in its existence. So when it was really feeling the brunt of the surge, when it was having suffered from multiple leadership losses, from massive resource losses, and so on and so forth. Anyway, it's the first time I'd read the text, and I had also just finished doing some other general reading around insurgency for some of the other projects that I'm working on. And I was just struck by the parallels. I mean, not just the parallels, it was literally like Abu Hamza had just finished a copy of The War of the Flea by Robert Tabor or something like that, and thought, you know what, that sounds like it would work in our context too. And I remember vividly chatting with Craig about the kind of intertextuality of how this group appears to be forming, or appears to have formed its doctrine, and wanted to take that a bit further. So I remember we spoke about just doing, or I initially said that it would be cool to do something just on that one text, and then the reader was it was an expansion of that. And I'm really glad that we did do an expansion, because there's so much really interesting stuff out there. I mean, too much interesting documentation, really. So actually selecting the few texts that we did was a real challenge. But I think in the grand scheme of things, we managed to pare it down to the real milestone key things that enabled us not only to talk about the Islamic State as it is today, and perhaps where it's going to be going in future years, but to talk about and to speak to the kind of permanence of this organization, or not necessarily the permanence, but the longevity of its strategic doctrine, and also the way it evolved over the last few decades, not just since 2014 when it declared itself a caliphate, but from the many years before that when it was in the running. So that was one of the main things that went into our selection. How can we tell a comprehensive, though of course not exhaustive, story of this organization through its own texts, and one that really does capture the full spectrum of its many years in existence?
Thank you, I appreciate that. So I think, I'm not sure if all of our audience knows this, but we at the Program on Extremism obviously are working on a big project that we're hoping to launch in the spring called the ISIS Files. And we're actually lucky enough to have all three of the authors of this book working on that project. And at the Program on Extremism, Horror and I have been dealing with a lot of the legal and ethical issues of such documents. And so I kind of wanted to pivot in to the questions of the legal and ethical issues associated with writing a book like this.
Sure. Look, those considerations were massive for us. And I think it's important for really anyone that's kind of writing on an organization and movement like the Islamic State. You know, there are going to be really important ethical considerations for that research. And I guess we were particularly aware of these, not just ethical questions, but also legal considerations. And so, just from that legal perspective, we were really fortunate that Michael Dwyer at Hearst, that one of the first things that we did as part of those initial discussions about writing the book was to bring up these potential issues, particularly in a place like Australia and the UK, and immediately sought legal advice. And our understanding was from those lawyers that it wouldn't be a problem, that the book wouldn't be a problem because of the approach that we took in how we presented those primary source materials. And really, decisions that we made about how to present those materials it went beyond those technical legal considerations to some really big ethical considerations in this field regarding primary source material access and analysis, its importance for understanding these issues, and also the potential and perceived kind of risks associated with that. So as a consequence, each chapter features excerpts of the primary source materials. And those excerpts are preceded by introductory comments that kind of provide context for the primary source, and then are proceeded by kind of an in-depth analysis. And throughout the text, we're constantly providing caveats and qualifiers. We're constantly pointing out where a particular declaration was false, or it was kind of like a misdirection, explaining how certain events that were described, certain predictions that the group made, did or did not kind of pan out. So we were very, very conscious of having an approach that was going to cover these kind of key issues. And most importantly, that the book would contribute to what I think we all think is one of the most important ethical issues for this field, a really important methodological issue for academics, and I think a really important tradecraft issue for national security practitioners. And it's developing an appreciation for the value of primary source materials, having a methodical approach to how you engage with those materials that is kind of grounded in an awareness of the kind of the lenses that we as analysts bring to this, the lenses which we're conscious of and also unconscious of, I guess, when we're analyzing primary source materials. And being conscious, I think, of the really important impact on the mentality of individuals and the culture that can be fostered in teams when you're engaging with these primary source materials. You know, that there is there's kind of an honesty that you have to have with the material and with yourself, and assessing the way that you're countering these groups that is actually really important. And so we kind of saw the book as kind of like a mechanism, a vehicle for achieving those things. And we hope that in a small way, the book is also an example of that in practice.
Absolutely. I mean, just looking at the footnotes in your book, it's probably my favorite part. You know, a lot of times people will brush over the footnotes, but there's so much meat in there, and then there's so much contextualization and links to other authors and research, and really, I think you guys did an excellent job with that.
I think as part of the book as well, I mean, there are 15 chapters, probably a couple of dozen, there's probably a couple of dozen primary sources that are kind of feature pieces across the 15 chapters. But I mean, there's, if you will, over 100 other primary source materials that are referred to in the text. So, and that is from the 1990s all the way up to Baghdadi's death. So it's
links to other research too. Like anyone who
and absolutely, yeah.
Go down, you know, any one of these speeches, you can go down a black hole of, you know, a whole nother realm of research regarding just one small issue. And I think that's a really important part of this book.
And it was something that we were very strategic about, to ensure that we kind of positioned what we thought were these milestone kind of pieces in the broader kind of context of propaganda at the time, the actions that the organization was taking, broader strategic and historical considerations. And I think that was part of having an approach that was not only going to kind of satisfy these ethical considerations, but those really important methodological and analytical and strategic ones as well.
Thank you. Greg, I wanted to jump to you. So as Haro mentioned, there's about 15 chapters that are divided into 4 main historical periods. And I wanted to kind of understand a bit more about the rationale and the decision to go back to 1994, which I completely support, but let's elaborate on it for the audience as well.
It's you know, it's an interesting story, because originally we started with the first year of the Islamic State as we understand the movement solidifying or consolidating politically in 2006, in late 2006, when it announces itself, announces the dissolution of al-Qaeda in Iraq, and names itself, and Mujahideen Shura Council actually, and names itself the Islamic State. And we started the book there, you know, from a scoping perspective and trying to limit the project to something that, and also avoid some controversy about, you know, predecessor groups and who was this or that and what were they named. And a reviewer came back and was like, you know, this is solid, but it's missing a huge chunk. And that is the roots. You cannot talk about this movement. And of course, that's something that all three of us have talked about incessantly, about the roots of the understanding the roots of the organization. So it's ironic to get our own kind of perspective pushed back in our face, and is like, oh yeah, of course we have to do that, which then meant having to rewrite an entire part of the book up front. But so thankful for that was Ahmed Hashim, who's written a lot about early insurgency in Iraq, and as well as having a recent book, Caliphate Out, the Caliphate at War. And it was really great feedback. So the field working as it's supposed to work and shaping scholarly works, I think, is an important aspect to that story. The other is getting the opportunity at the same time as researchers. We were like, this is fantastic. Now we can really write about these roots, and we can tell our publisher we're going to expand the book by like almost a third and put in stuff that, to be honest, again, had read lots of summaries about Zarqawi's first speech ever in a Jordanian courtroom, and then his first speech almost unnoticed as the leader of an insurgent group in Iraq, which didn't really have a name even. And being able to tie those together, look at the continuity of that, and then, and I'll invite Aurora to jump in here, but also, and then kind of use that to frame their first real strategic communication and how they understood and communicated a strategy of what they were trying to do in Iraq. And Zarqawi's famous letter, that's probably the most well-read of their primary documents. And it's usually used to kind of critique Zarqawi from really Zawahiri's perspective on how al-Qaeda was not necessarily satisfied with them, even though they eventually absorbed them in. And so being able to create a foundation and an environment for how a strategy is developed and evolves was really important, and it almost didn't happen. That's kind of the irony. And just to tie into Thomas Heghammer's book right now on Abdullah Azzam, you can now, having gone through that process, you can really see what Thomas was going after with the influence of the early Afghan period, on this particular movement and people like Zarqawi. He might be influenced a lot by Maqdisi, but he's certainly trying to copy Abdullah Azzam in every way that he can. And Aurora, if you jump in to talk about that strategy doc for that part.
I mean, I think that the addition of kind of what became part one to the book, it was this weird kind of situation where, well, yeah, of course we put that in. Like, you know, what were we kind of thinking? And when we read over these texts, and even we're reading back through as part of the review process, there are all these threads that kind of emerge when you go through the primary source material. And the process of writing the book, and even more so when we were reviewing and editing the book, found ourselves going down these different burrows and threads. And one of the really difficult things with the analysis section was to say, okay, what do we actually want to highlight? And what do we kind of want to draw out as a thread and kind of let readers kind of go in their own direction with this. And I think that in so many ways, Zarqawi is like symbolic of so many of the issues that scholars and practitioners have had with trying to understand and interpret this movement. When you see Zarqawi, when you see these horrific propaganda videos that he featured in, that he was the star in, and you kind of see the way that Zarqawi presented himself, I think purposely presented himself, and you hear these the instinctual response is to be appalled by him and to see him as a thug, as he was at the time, as he was seen at the time, that he's this stupid street thug, vicious murderer, and how convenient that he now leads this murderous kind of horde. what I think is kind of really reinforced, particularly when you're reading part one, is that there was a really important strategic mind there. And even if that letter, and even if those speeches weren't all Zarqawi, it was at least in part reflective of Zarqawi and the small team that he had around him. And that in itself is significant. And so this part one, those early foundational years, really, that was the root system. And you can see the way, and you know, this is something which, you know, Charlie has written so much about, the way in which that kind of permeates throughout the organization. And during times of success, yeah, they'll refer back to those older periods, but it's in times of crisis. It's in those times of crisis that they really go back to their foundations. Those occasions where they're in decline, that they'll go back to those foundations, and they will draw not just inspiration in a symbolic sense, but real pragmatic approaches to how to deal with it.
I'm actually going to go a little bit off cue from our what we kind of were planning, because I just got a really great question from Gina Lagan, which kind of ties into what we were talking about before. And she asks, how did your opinion of any of the leaders' influence styles change as you did this research? For example, I gained a whole new understanding of Zarqawi's decision-making from your book that I didn't have from other sources about him. And I think this kind of ties into what you were both mentioning before, but also I didn't know if Charlie wanted to jump in at all.
Yeah, that is a really good question. I think for me, the thing that is really striking, and Huro was just laying it out there, is yes, there have been multiple leadership changes, and yes, you have to recognize the huge impact that individuals have had on this movement over the course of its history. And it's also important not to find ourselves putting too much on Zarqawi when the likes of, Abu Bakr al-Baghdadi, he was leader of the Islamic State for nearly 10 years. And it really transformed in the course of that period. But having said that, just to go back to Zarqawi, I think what I find really interesting in just kind of observing the group on a day-to-day basis now is just how much that legacy is still there, and how it's still cultivated by the central media Dewan of the Islamic State. So the folk right at the top who are kind of dictating the organizational line in response to changing events on the ground. And probably my favorite example of this kind of this legacy is the way that the Islamic State responded to its total territorial collapse in Iraq and Syria. Of course, it's still present, it's still fighting, it's still very dangerous in both of those places, but it's not the proto-state that it was until last year. So I think that's just important to set that out pretty clearly. But in trying to navigate through that period of defeat, the huge material losses that it sustained between 2016 and 2019, it's really interesting how the central media Dewan turned to the same sort of strategic narrative as was set out by Zarqawi in the aftermath of the siege of Fallujah in 2004, which was another time that this was the predecessor of the Islamic State, very much a different organization materially to what we conceive of now as the Islamic State. But it was an unmitigated loss for the group in terms of the number of soldiers that it had killed in Fallujah as the coalition forces went to sweep them out of control of it, the number of leaders that died, the number of tactical and strategic setbacks faced during that particular episode in the conflict. In the aftermath of it, Zarqawi came out with this statement that did the rounds and has been doing the rounds for a few years now, recirculated by the official propagandists of ISIS as well as supporters, that basically said, yes, sure, we lost Fallujah. We lost that bit of territory. It was materially very painful. But in the grand scheme of things, what it communicates about us as an organization, as a movement, as representatives of the global jihad and the global Islamic Ummah, is so much more important. So yes, tactically it was a defeat, but in the grand scheme of things, it put us on the map. It showed Iraqis that we were fighting for them. It showed other jihadist factions, who call them Mujahideen brothers or whatever, but it showed them that that group at the time was leading the fight against the Americans. It showed that they could fight they could fight a technological war, not just a kind of a low-level insurgency, but they could put up real resistance. And that kind of constant return to the symbolic impact and the immense weight that symbolism can carry, not just through a few years, but through decades, I find absolutely fascinating. And that is something that Zarqawi brought to the table, and it continues to be very much entwined with the Islamic State today. And there's loads of other things like that. I mean, when you think about the strategic communication operations of the group, there's a text that before we did this book that Craig and I swapped between us a few times. It was the Abu Hamza al-Muhajir message about media jihad, where he set out 10 points about what kind of effective media jihad looks like. And the kind of core parts of that vision that he had back in 2010, the speech was published just after he got killed, they are still very much present in the core doctrine of the Islamic State today. So yes, this is an organization that changes and has changed profoundly over the last few years. And new leaders do bring with them new skill sets, new possible mistakes as well. But certainly there is a tendency to lean on the legacy, or at least the positive aspects of the legacies of these individuals as well. And to be able to speak to that systematically in this book was something that was really exciting.
Thank you. Harara, I wanted to jump to you, but also Craig, I think you might be able to jump in as well. I wanted to ask about your individual and collective experiences as researchers and practitioners, and how has that influenced the book?
Sure. Well, I mean, at every step of writing and reviewing and editing this book, there were certain experiences that I kind of kept returning to. You know, when I was when I was a lecturer and when I kind of supervised kind of research students, what I found was that many students had expressed to me a hesitancy to engage with the primary source materials. And there were a range of reasons for that. But one of the most common was you kind of say, well, you know, oh, I don't know whether I want to, you know, read this material. I'll just go to the secondary sources. That should be fine. And because, well, no, it's actually important for the reasons that we've been speaking about so far this morning. And as you'd speak to them, it'd come out that, well, that they'd say something quite sheepishly like, oh, you know, I don't want to, you know, kind of radicalize. And it was one of these things where I then kind of thought, well, the first couple of times this happened, I wasn't sure how to kind of take this. And this was a consistent kind of message that I was getting from students, despite the nature of the lectures and the tutes and everything else. And so for me, that said something about the change that was occurring in academia, in research. And as a former practitioner, the kind of change in mentality and culture that was happening in the fields of practice as well. And so I kept returning to that about, okay, how can this book be a way, hopefully in a small way, to contribute to that change in how people engage with primary source materials and think about primary source materials. You know, I mean, when I was working operations as well, you know, I would always think to myself, it would be great to have a resource that you could just kind of very quickly refer to different historical periods or different documents or different events as, you know, the kind of people that you're looking at are kind of bringing up these issues. And so that was something else when it came to the structure of the book. We tried to make sure that this was a resource that you could pick up and you could read in a variety of different ways. You could go to each chapter and get plenty out of that chapter. You could read it as a standalone. You could go to each of the different historical periods and kind of learn more about those 4 historical periods, or of course, you could read it cover to cover. And we wanted to make sure that it was a text that was going to be accessible in a range of different ways, so a range of different audiences would have that. And all of it kind of referred to the importance of that. You know, working in strategic policy roles previously, I kept coming back to that because there are all these threads throughout the book at different levels of the book, within chapters, across historical periods, across the span of the book as a whole. And these threads and trends kind of repeat themselves across this decade-long history. That's really important for strategic policy people to be able to kind of pick up on and expand. And you know, as you know, I spend a lot of time overseas. The last 8 weeks have been the longest I've been without kind of traveling into Asia or the Middle East for the work that I do with, particularly with civil society. And those were the experiences that probably hit the most. That, you know, everyone kind of remembers the line from the former Secretary of Defense, Chuck Hagel, that we've never seen anything like this, that 2014 line. Well, working in communities where Islamic State have been active, where operatives are still active, where Islamic State have controlled those communities and those towns, I hear variations of that line in Arabic and Dari and Mindanao and Tagalog. Just people saying, we've never seen anything like this in the southern Philippines. And so we've never seen anything like this. The black shirts came in and they were controlling this place, and they didn't go after 2 or 3 days. You hear similar things with when I was with the kind of engaged with the Syrian, Free Syrian media. I would say similar things, but we haven't seen this before. And that really highlighted to me the importance of helping communities to understand the adversary that they were up against, and that there were these core ideas and principles that were being transferred around the world to kind of help shape the way that others kind of like pursued the revolution and kind of resisted. And so you can kind of see at all these different levels, there were these experiences. And I know that, you know, Charlie and Craig spoke in similar ways about these experiences that we kept coming back to and saying, we've got to make sure that this is addressed for this reason.
Craig, I just wanted to ask if you wanted to jump in at all.
Yeah, I mean, not to echo, well, I mean, echoing what Herrero said without talking too long, because I know we want to get to questions from folks, but certainly, you know, my research in the Islamic State is inspired by practice. Before I became an academic, before I did a dissertation on the Islamic State's political worldview, it was shaped as a practitioner. And the Islamic State, the early Islamic State, the first year of the Islamic State, which is a chapter that I wrote, and to me it was a little risky, was putting 5 different texts, really short texts, but to try to cover a really complex time. And it reflects the struggle I had as a practitioner trying to understand the politics of the Islamic State, which I think is an under-researched, under-thought about concept, is how much of a political actor they are in Sunni communities, against the Muslim Brotherhood, against other Islamist movements, Al-Qaeda. And I really struggled as a practitioner in Iraq in 2007 trying to understand that. And I knew their strategy was very effective, that Zarqawi's kind of residual strategy, even after he died, was frustrating our strategy. That was interesting and, you know, recognizable. But it wasn't until I read Abu Umar's speech in the spring of 2007, which we have in the book, that I said, now I understand what this is all about. And it's reading the primary sources, even as a practitioner. And that's something that I get to do, you know, at a Naval War College, teaching largely military officers, is try to instill that same kind of idea, or something that I've learned, is that it's the primary sources can help you understand the politics, which is what all of this violence, political violence, and military strategies are trying to shape and dominate in certain ways. And it's certainly a deficiency amongst us in a lot of ways, which is why we were inspired to put this together.
Excellent, thank you. And I think that pivots perfectly into a question from Adam Hoffman. who asks, what are the main differences you found between public ISIS statements, propaganda, and internal documents, strategy, and administration documents? I mean, I know all three of you have seen parts or some of the ISIS files, as well as collections by Ayman al-Tamimi and Aaron Zellin as well. So if you wanted to touch on that.
Charlie, you want to take that? Or?
Yeah, sorry, I was struggling to find the mute button. That's a good question. I mean, in my experience, I mean, it'd be great to have Ayman chirp in with a comment here. Say again.
Monstrous comment.
I was debating whether to say monstrous, but I don't know whether that reference would go down. Hello, Ayman, if you're watching. The administrative documents that he's done such an amazing job of pulling together, and also a lot of the documents that are included in the ISIS files, they are very kind of functional. Yes, they have the kind of trappings of jihadi governance, and they do like name check certain references to the Quran or Hadith or figures in Islamic history, but they, in my experience of them at least, and I want to emphasize that this is just in my experience of them, they are kind of documents that are geared towards performing a very specific, very practical function. Whereas, and in that sense, they're kind of tactically valuable and immediately kind of use to the organization. These texts that we've included in the book, I mean, I guess you have the strategic policy statements, the speeches from folk like Zarqawi, either of the Baghdadis, the new spokesman until he was killed last year, actually, Muhajir. These big policy statements where they are essentially trying to, yes, to an extent, incite certain acts on the part of their supporters, but also I think these are in large part about setting out the framework through which they want their listeners to understand the world around them and understand the dynamics around them. I mean, there's a huge focus on what other jihadi groups are doing in these texts. It's not just what the Crusader enemy is doing or the Rafida in Iraq or what have you. There's a lot of focus on intra-jihadi dynamics and relations and feuds. And that's a really interesting thing that I think is geared towards essentially saying to supporters, right, this is the line you're taking, and here are the reasons for it, but this is the line you're taking. And if you deviate from that norm, then you are not our friends. And that's one of the kind of really interesting functions of these statements as I see it. And then there are the documents which aren't necessarily geared towards that kind of mass audience. And so one example would be the Fallujah memorandum. I mean, Craig, would you agree that that's kind of orientated towards a different function than the strategic policy statements? And I can see you nodding, so I'll carry on saying it. There's also the advice to soldiers and leaders of the Islamic State. So giving instructions about how to interact with local populations, how to actually navigate through the insurgency at that point in time. And of course, they don't have the same kind of exhortative value as some of the strategic policy statements, but they are really, really interesting texts to study. They don't deal with dynamics, they don't deal with they don't respond to politics or particular changes in circumstances, apart from the fact that they are kind of being issued in order to help the Islamic State get through a particular event or particular development or phase in its history. And they are, for that very reason, I think, a lot more kind of straightforward in terms of, they say, we're going to do this is why you should do it. Sometimes when they're making that this is why you should do it justification, it can be with a reference to Islamic history, or it can be with something which is a lot more straightforward or immediately easy to understand why they're making that. So there's a lot of variance, and I mean, our analysis that's appended to each of these chapters, that is, I think it's useful analysis, but it's certainly not the last word on any of these texts. And hopefully people who have this book will use the text within them to conduct their own assessments, own evaluations, and come to conclusions which hopefully are complementary, not mutually exclusive with ours. But that's the kind of intention here, that we open up these really rich documents to a much wider audience.
Yeah, I'd like to just chime in briefly. I mean, that's a great explanation. I think one of my favorite Adam, this is, again, your good question. One of my favorite docs in here, excerpts, is from the Utabi documents in the first year of the Islamic State. It's a critique of the hypocritical practices where they're stealing from Sunni businessmen in Anbar. And it's more of a expose. It was never meant to be public. Of course, Al-Qaeda made sure it was very public in 2013. And so it does show, a lot of the stuff that doesn't get put into documents. And that's another good rationale for like the ISIS files. Like, there's stuff that they don't ever expect to see the light of day that then can come out and expose some of the real practices that they have and how that might contrast with rhetoric or propaganda. So that's an important aspect. But largely along what Aurora was saying is the reinterpretation of some of these documents. The Utabi documents long been cited as examples of the apocalyptic kind of tendencies of al-Zarqawi's successors, when it really almost shows their pragmatism instead, where they basically fire Utabi because he wants to burn Sunnis alive, Sunni tribal fighters alive, and they know that they cannot go that far and be successful in Iraq. And that's something they certainly struggle with, but you see that in the Utabi docs. And so there is some reality that peeks through occasionally, and that's the fun part of it.
We have a lot of questions that touch on two things. I'll jump to the first one, and that's really on the relationship between Al-Qaeda and the Islamic State. And they kind of evolve a little bit, but a lot of people have a question on what is this relationship and how is this relationship evolved, and how have we seen this evolution in the book?
You wrote a lot about it.
Yeah.
Is that me? Right.
Yeah, you're up.
It's a great question because it's one of the key threads that actually it kind of first emerges in the first part of the book, and it kind of appears throughout the text. So one of the things with the way that we'd kind of structured and planned the book was that if you wanted to kind of track these different threads, you'd be able to kind of do that. And so what you kind of see is the beginning of that relationship under Zarqawi's leadership. And you also see really, again, the roots of how that relationship was going to develop, was going to evolve into the future. I'm not saying that you could have predicted it at that point, but there was no question that there were a lot of tensions from the very beginning. And those tensions were kind of rooted in not just these clear, these kind of ideological and strategic differences that needed to be kind of like ironed out, but also personal issues, the kind of the personalities that were involved. The fact that with Zarqawi, you have this kind of, this relatively young man leading this kind of organization, really pushing the strategic and operational kind of envelope. And it made these comparatively older hands kind of uncomfortable. And then as you kind of track that relationship through parts 2, 3, and 4, you can kind of see the way in which the evolution of these kind of two movements kind of played off each other, how the tensions and synchronicities had kind of impacted. And I think that we can kind of tie in Gina's question about leadership here when we talk about that relationship between Al-Qaeda and ISIS, because so many of the events in and around that 2013-14 period where Baghdadi declares the Islamic State and Iraq and ISIS, and the implications that that had for the relationship with al-Qaeda, and then basically a year later declaring the caliphate and Baghdadi as the caliph. These were challenges to a position really that al-Qaeda had had for many years, which was kind of the flagship of that global jihad. And so throughout the book, there are these different ways in which we try to trace the way that that relationship changed, from a leadership perspective, a strategic perspective, and even operational. I don't know whether you guys want to add something else to that.
I was just gonna put you on the spot again. I was gonna put you on the spot before, so I may as well do it again. Because I wanted you to talk a little bit about Adnani and his role in all of this. And I remember you, we spoke a lot about that kind of dynamic and that exchange between ISIS and Al-Qaeda in the course of putting this book together. So I wonder if you could jump in on that. I just realized I'm not meant to be asking any questions, so that will be my first and last question.
Go ahead.
Yeah, the way in which Adnani really stepped forward in 2013, early 2014, and kind of to lead the propaganda push against al-Qaeda is really significant. And it kind of ties in with something which, you know, both Charlie and Craig have written a lot about, and that is the way in which the organizational structure of not just the media unit, but how the media unit fits into the broader Islamic State organization. The way in which Adnani stepping forward kind of reflected some of those security considerations that had emerged over time, putting the spokesperson forward to lead the propaganda charge so that the senior leadership can kind of be protected, because when senior leaders are out front, there are significant kind of risks associated with that. And so the way in which Adnani led that propaganda charge, the way in which his, not just the way that he spoke, but the way that he presented, he was very much a charismatic leader. The way that he was with the way that he was presenting himself, he was pushing out front, so that the more, what they would describe as a more of a legal, rational, traditional leader, the caliph, could kind of be protected and continue with his role. And Adnani emerges as a really important figure moving forward during this boom period for Islamic State. These speeches, these fiery kind of speeches that he emerged, that he kind of released, and the way that supporters responded to those speeches as well. The attacks in the aftermath of Adnani's speeches, after he kind of called for Australians to be attacked and Europeans to be attacked, you know, these were really kind of significant. And I think that in a kind of weird way, the tensions between Islamic State and al-Qaeda created this crisis opportunity for Adnani to step forward and establish himself as that charismatic figure out front. And he was able to play off of that up until his death. So thanks for the question, Charlie.
Thank you, guys. The other question that I'm seeing over and over and over again is about the loss of territory by the Islamic State, and what lessons have been learned and the next steps that you think the group will be taking. And this has come in many forms and all about current events as well. So if you want to tie in COVID and the coronavirus and what's happening now.
Could I take the first part of that, and I'll let the two of you jump in on more recent. Charlie mentioned the Fallujah. They have these cycles, and that's how Haror likes to talk about it. These cycles as ebb and flow. And Fallujah is an early one. But it's when they're really small and they're developing and they're trying to establish the name. It's the defeat in 2007 in the first year really the first year that they're established, and then they have this tremendous defeat. And the Fallujah memorandum that we highlight in the part 2 is really it's their reaction to defeat and their strategy to come out of defeat. And the value in that, I think, is that you can see them already reflecting back to that. The language that they use in speeches, you can hear Adnani saying it as early as 2016 before his death, that we've done this before, we've been through this before, it is a possibility. Obviously, with God, we can accomplish anything. But largely it's the confidence that they were able to kind of navigate the shoals of a previous defeat. Defeat is not permanent. It is a relatively temporary condition. It can be permanent, but for this movement, they're going to do everything they can to make these defeats temporal. And so, just not to take too long to answer this question, and I'll let my colleagues talk about more recent interpretations of how they're going to deal with their current temporary defeat or permanent, depending. And it's how to deal with other Sunnis within the territories that they either influence, control, or actually physically hold for long periods of time. And that is what they've struggled with. They've done it in a much more pragmatic and nuanced way that we understand. We really see them as being totally rejected as part of the awakening in 2007. And there's lots of truth to that, but it's not universal. And there is plenty of slide back by a lot of political groups, other insurgent groups, and just average Sunnis who feel discontented with the way that either the geopolitical fortunes are happening in their region or the local governance. And so the Islamic State's very careful to shape their image locally as well as globally in order to take advantage of these things.
I'll just jump in quickly to talk about where the Islamic State is today versus this time a year ago or in recent years. And then Haro, I don't know if you can talk about some of the, well, you can talk about what you want to talk about. I won't ask anything of you again. The Islamic State, yes, it is by many definitions of the word defeat, it is defeated. But I think it's important, really important to keep in mind that it is still carrying out hundreds of attacks across a range of kind of tactical forms on a monthly basis. Thousands of attacks since this time last year. And they're not all kind of relatively low impact IEDs or assassinations with pistols, as is kind of the emergent trend, or has been the emergent trend in Syria, in eastern Syria and Iraq over the last year. Certainly in those two countries, the Islamic State is not fighting in a way that is akin to how it was fighting back in 2013, 2014. We're not looking at conventional warfare so much as a total reversion to asymmetric tactics. Maybe not quite total, but there's certainly a reliance there. But in West Africa, which is the province, West Africa province of the Islamic State, it spans northeastern Nigeria, as well as the Sahel, and is a massive wedge of territory. It was somewhere that the Islamic State adopted into its global brand a few years ago. And at the time, people didn't take it particularly seriously, largely because Abu Bakr Shakau, who somehow is still alive, is a complete nutter. And everyone thought this guy is a nutter. He's a liability to the Islamic State, and that brand and this brand, they won't work. These two organizations won't work together. But then Abu Bakr Shakau ended up doing his own thing, still is doing his own thing in northeast Nigeria. And in the meantime, there's been a big ebb and flow of the capabilities of West Africa province. But currently, that is the place that I'm far more worried about than anywhere else in the world when it comes to where the Islamic State seems to be most kind of effective and most comfortable and most confident with what it's doing. I mean, ISIS, as you know, publishes a weekly newspaper, and about 80% of the front pages of Al-Naba, this newspaper, for the last few months have just revolved around West Africa. It is really foregrounding for a group that is based in Iraq and Syria, for a group that's history is in Iraq and Syria. It's putting a huge amount of effort to incorporate West Africa into that. And also considering the kind of tenor of the operations and what they look like, we're looking at more conventional warfare there. Sorry, my baby's going mad in the background. And that's extremely worrying. It's also something which is going under the radar a lot of the time as well. So when just thinking about the Islamic State as an organization that did face a massive series of setbacks over the last few years, and is in many definitions of the word defeated, it is still ascendant in other parts of the world. And yes, it may never get back to where it was between 2014 and 2016, but it doesn't need to be there to be extremely dangerous.
Excellent. We're running out of time, but I'm going to combine two questions. I think that they kind of build on each other. So Adam Hoffman had asked, what's the main source of influence on on ISIS in the past, either jihadi or non-jihadi groups? And James Forrest is giving you some homework, and he's asking, who do you see as the most influential strategic thinker now or in the future? Craig, should we start with you based on your facial reactions?
Could you repeat James's that's a tough one. I appreciate Adam's question.
He's decided to put you all to work. Who do you see as the most influential strategic thinker for the movement now, or who will emerge in the future?
Yeah,
James,
I guess is past or posthumous, or do they have to be? You know, it doesn't have to be alive, is what I think about. But I'll pass that off to anybody else.
An influence and make a resurgence. If we think about, you know, Azam's resurgence,
yeah,
I think that could be interesting. You know.
Her, why don't you take a crack at that? Because you've talked about posthumous charisma and a lot of our talks.
You may have noticed a trend that when the bunny is needed to be thrown in front of the truck, I'm your guy, right? So what was so just repeat the first question. I'll try to combine my answer.
Yeah. So the first question was, what are the main sources of influence on ISIS, both jihadi and non-jihadi movements? And that could be individuals, books, events, even. And then thinking towards the future, we know we've seen how the group has evolved. So where is the group going? And is there going to be a specific individual that will help the group get there?
You're exactly right that, you know, these are very deeply kind of connected kind of questions, you know. What are the main sources and where is it going? And I think that when you look at this history, and the entire expanse of the history, what you find is that there are these self-generating, self-reinforcing kind of concepts that keep kind of emerging. And we can make assumptions about where that influence came from. We can make assumptions and say, oh, well, these concepts, they sound a lot like Azam, and these concepts sounds a lot like the management of savagery. And what you actually end up finding, as Charlie and Craig have written a lot about, just using the management of savagery as an example, but also when they've been asked about Suri, is how dismissive they are of just, oh, well, yeah, it was interesting, but what a waste of paper. Oh, it was interesting, but it was as if you read my mind, because I've been thinking about that for quite some time. It's kind of basic, I'm paraphrasing al-Zarqawi about the management of savagery. And so one of the reasons why this is so important is that over time, there's self-referencing that kind of goes on. It becomes, there are these self-reinforcing kind of cycles. So they're creating their own foundations of jurisprudential precedents and strategic precedents for leadership succession, as well as an example, which they then refer to justify further on down the track. And so I think that what you actually have here during, and what perhaps, and I'm sure I'll be proven wrong very, very quickly, but what you have through the period of 2013 to 2016, there's this most recent period of boom is the establishment of precedents for leadership selection, leadership succession, military operations, governance, lessons that are being learned there, which will be referred to in the future as, if you know, as they kind of start a resurgence once again. And so, while it may sound like I'm avoiding the question, it's actually a really important way to think about this issue. Is that these self-referencing. So, on this leadership succession issue, when Baghdadi was killed, so much of the really important debate and discussion that was going on was about the legitimacy, the jurisprudential legitimacy of succession, and the jurisprudential kind of nuances of, oh, well, this succession and that succession, oh, this is going to be justified, but this won't be justified. What actually matters to this group is what it has said, the precedents that it has established for itself. And it doesn't just do this in a jurisprudential sense, it does in a strategic and operational sense. And I think that emphasizes how important it is to go back to these texts cyclically, because that's what our adversary does, going back to these texts cyclically. And so I think that that more is going to emerge about Baghdadi, more is going to emerge about Adnani, and it will shape future activities.
Yeah, I call them serial plagiarists, and I really, those are really tough questions from Adam and James, because I would struggle to pin, other than, you know, how Herrera described it. They really take bits and pieces of lots of stuff. They are stingy about attribution. They're plagiarists, like I said, and then eventually it becomes theirs and they own it. And then that is the most important thing. And then after a while, it becomes very difficult. Management of savagery, again, I'm always very skeptical of people who are like, this is what they're doing. If they're outside the movement, it's already suspect for a lot of different reasons. And it could be just footnotes that the person's using.
Excellent. And now we're out of time, but I just kind of want to go around really quickly and ask your favorite part about researching this book. Obviously, the answer is hanging off each other, but if you have anything else that you wanted to kind of add in before we sign off. Charlie, we'll start with you.
I mean, it was fun writing a book with two other massive nerds. Sorry, guys. But the hours and hours that we spent talking about each of these documents and trying to, as I think it was Herrera that said it earlier, trying to figure out what it was that we wanted to highlight from these texts, given that there are infinite things that you could highlight. And yeah, just the process was really something that was very rewarding. And I don't know, I came out of it feeling like I understood the Islamic State much better. I mean, I suppose you should come out of a book feeling that way. But I'm glad I did. The opposite would have been terrible. Craig, Herrera, take it away.
You know, for me, it's the amount of help that we got along the way, which was, it still staggers me. Hassan shared Fallujah memorandum with me when I had difficulties finding it. Some of these are really difficult to find. Mo Hafez, Nibras, Kazemi, Ryan Evans, who published a lot of our earlier kind of explorations on these topics. My friend Anas, who helped me do lots of the hard translations. And so when you kind of look at all of that over time, it's pretty gratifying to have so much support from a large community. Ayman was mentioned earlier. They're just really, Aaron Zellen, they are really selfless about sharing primary sources, and it's really gratifying.
Yeah, I mean, obviously, I agree with all that, and yeah, there was a ton of support along the way, and the way the book kind of was an opportunity for us to question our own thinking. I guess the point that I'll highlight is that it was kind of cathartic as well. You know, that these were things that we've been working on for a long time, like. There's a lot of there's a lot of a kind of advisory work that that kind of Charlie does. There's a lot of there's a lot of primary source materials and engaging with locals that Charlie has done. You know, Craig's kind of background and military background, like getting feedback from community from people in communities and from kind of veterans and current and former operators where they kind of read it. Where they've read the book and they've kind of got in contact with us and said, some have said that it was cathartic. Others have kind of said, actually, it kind of brought up a lot of things, you know, which has been tough. That I can speak on behalf of Charlie and Craig on this point. Like that actually means a lot to us because those were kind of key audiences for us as we were writing this book. And I can say to those people that, you know, it had a similar effect for us when we were putting it all together and now as we read the book. And I guess that's what we hope is that this is we actually hope that the book would be obsolete and it would be this thing which, you know, people don't need to return to, but it was written precisely because we've got a long way to go. And the trends that we're seeing in Syria and Iraq now, parts of Asia, and of course, Charlie captured it perfectly. What we're seeing in Africa now, there's still a long way to go. So, we just hope that people might be able to get some value out of it.
You're on mute.
Sorry. Thank you again for joining me today. If you haven't gotten your copy, there's a 30% discount code. So please purchase this. Help these guys buy a cup of coffee after this pandemic is over, because I believe that's what their cut is. And thank you so much. Please join me in thanking Hororo, Charlie, and Craig, and keep an eye out for their future work on the ISIS files, which will be coming in spring. So thank you.